I'm going to get started, I guess, even though I think we're supposed to start in about 4 minutes from now, just because I actually have a lot of content for you guys, and I want to make sure to get through like as much as I can, but by no means am I guaranteeing that you're going to get everything you need to know, but I'm hoping you'll get a lot of information out of this session. So my name's Brant. I work at Acquia, and I do basically like proof of concept work. I work on demos. I do a lot of development within our, I guess, under the umbrella of sales. And so I'm kind of like that person that's building the proof of concept that gets shown to organizations that are actually vetting Drupal. And part of that process obviously has been learning a lot of Drupal 8 at work, trying to get ramped up so that as soon as people are selling Drupal 8, we're showing them a cool demo of Drupal 8. And so I also maintain some modules on Drupal.org, and I've started the process of upgrading some of my modules. And so just if anyone wants to follow along to this, there are some Drupal 8 example modules that I'm sort of going to be showing, and those are all on my GitHub on this link. And then the slides, these actual slides are on this site. And then if you need to get in contact with me, usually Twitter is the best way to do it, actually, because I don't necessarily always get my DMs on IRC or whatever, but I always get, if you send me a message on Twitter, I always get it. So feel free to ask questions that way afterward if we don't have time for questions. So yeah, this session, just in case you're not sure if you're in the right room, is about Drupal 8 and specifically building modules for Drupal 8. So I guess I'd like to get like a real quick sort of overview of just like who's in the room right now. And so can I get like if you want like a showing of hands of like, have you built any modules for Drupal in the past? Are you a Drupal developer? Okay, so probably like 60, 70% of the room. How many people have never used Drupal 7? All right, so everyone in the room has used Drupal 7. How many people have like installed and tried out Drupal 8 or like worked on it a little bit? Okay, awesome. So that's really good. That's good information to have. All right, cool. So yeah, when we talk about building modules for D8, when we talk about modules or extensions, what we're really talking about these little PHP projects that extend Drupal. But when we think about the idea of actually extending Drupal and what modules did for extending Drupal in the past, it's like we had a system that was essentially built around the idea of, if you needed to extend something, you had to have a hook available. And so maybe it meant patching that module to provide a hook or what have you. There were not a lot of modules that used like OOP type practices in Drupal. I think one of the ones that actually does in earlier versions is migrate, and that's one that you can actually extend and do things with. It's pretty cool. But overall, you were pretty much in a kind of a silo of like, if there's a hook available, I can change things somewhere along the chain of as Drupal builds something, or as Drupal builds up, bootstraps and builds up the whole website. I can possibly modify this array and change a little bit of information, change some outputs, so something that people do a lot. But we weren't really in a good position to say hack core without hacking core, like if you're at the keynote earlier when they talk about, and that's something that we can really kind of start to leverage in Drupal 8. So the things that I consider to be like the bare minimum, like basics, are these 8 things. And I'll go over all of them, hopefully at least get to the 6th thing. I might not get to Twig or plugins, but those are really topics for their own session in many ways. Like I'm not going to necessarily get so deep into this to be talking about those types of things, but I'll at least glaze over them if I can. But everything else I think that's on this list I'll get into. And so yeah, without any further delay, we should probably get started. So the first thing that's new in Drupal 8 is YAML. And you've probably heard a lot about YAML at this point, especially given the amount of hands I saw come up. People are fairly familiar. So the original sort of name behind it was that it was another markup language or yet another markup language, which was really not correct because it's not a markup language. So this sort of acronym got re-acronymed into YAML ain't markup language, which is self-referential. But essentially what they say on YAML.org is that it's a human-friendly data serialization standard, which is a nice way of saying this is like a human-readable way of setting up your areas of information. So it's not too dissimilar to what we've been doing already in Drupal, but it's useful. So when we look at why did we choose YAML in Drupal 8 as opposed to some other serialization format? So we look at it as being both human readable and machine readable, which is obviously important. And then another reason is that because the YML files, the YAML files, are not specific to Drupal. So one thing that is a theme that you'll see in this presentation and just overall in Drupal 8 is the idea that we are trying to get rid of Drupalisms. Because Drupalisms are non-inclusive, and we want people to come into Drupal that are completely cold, necessarily, but maybe know PHP, or even another language like Java or whatever, that can actually look at Drupal's code and say, okay, I can actually use this, and not be just scared of all of the specificity that's there and learning all the things around it. So not having a .info file means not having to configure your IDE to open up a .info file and read it as a PHP format so that you get proper syntax highlighting. Simple stuff like that actually is really helpful for developer experience. Some other formats, maybe XML or JSON. XML would require a Drupal-specific schema. That's a Drupalism. Now we're writing Drupal-specific XML files. It's, in my opinion, a little bit ugly. Or I link to a blog here, which is Chex' blog, who's a, if you know Chex, he's a strong, Drupal core contributor, somewhat, pretty famous in the community, obviously. But he mentioned that XML has cooties. I don't necessarily disagree with him. And then the note about JSON is that you can't really write comments in JSON because it won't parse. And non-ASCII characters in JSON require escaping. So that kind of removes the human readable component because now we're escaping strings and it's creating somewhat of a brittle format for us. So YAML is really helpful. So if we look at the structure of a .info file in Drupal 7, this is the first thing that you'll set up when you're starting a module. So in this case, we have kind of like a short version of setting up an array where we have name equals demo module, and then here's a description. Here's the version of core, here's its packaging, and then here's an array that we're defining of dependencies, and there may be a number of dependencies. And when we look at the variant to that in the new system, it's really similar, but it's a demo.info.yml file, so that's helpful. And we see that basically the only difference here is the inclusion of a colon instead of an equal sign. And then when defining an array in YAML, it's really all about tab spacing. So spacing and denoting that node is part of this dependencies array. Oops. So that's essentially YAML in a nutshell. The next thing that's probably really worth talking about for Drupal 8 is PSR0. So FIG is the Framework Interoperability Group, and it's a collection of people that work on projects. So Larry Garfield is one of the members, and he represents Drupal on our behalf. And essentially, they get together typically at conferences like PHP Tech, talk about problems that are similar, and come up with solutions that can help standardize PHP. And in this case, what we're talking about is PSR0, which is a guideline for autoloaders, basically. So how do you do autoloading? And what that comes down to is like a full standard. I'm not going to read this out completely. It looks like it's kind of wrapping off the screen even. But essentially, the top line is probably what's most important, is to use a fully qualified namespace. So the class should have the following structure. It's a vendor name, followed by the actual namespace of the project, and then the class name follows. So if we look at some examples from PHP projects, these are all, except for the fourth one, which is obviously pseudocode, are actual namespaces from projects that are used in Drupal 8. So if we look at the way that Guzzle works, we see that so Guzzle common event would be the namespace, and you would call that with something like a use statement, and that actually will then queue up the autoloader to find the right PHP file for you. So that's really useful because you can get around the whole sort of hell of trying to figure out which dependencies to include and where they are in relation to your current file and doing the whole include once garbage that you get without autoloaders, but also helps you deal with things like namespace collisions. So in the case of a couple of projects that are included with Drupal 8 core, we have Guzzle and Symfony's event dispatcher. And what's going on here is I've actually, what's the screenshot here is a search from PHP Storm where I can actually, if you're not using an IDE in this is sort of a tangent, but if you're not using an IDE in developing on Drupal 8, like I was a Vim guy before I really got into doing more Drupal 8 stuff, and I was able to get away with that pretty heavily up until really like a year ago. And at some point, I had to get an IDE that I could use for Drupal 8 development because it helps you actually debug code and do things that, like looking up things like classes without a lot of extra work. So, rather than doing, cd .. /.. like a billion times all over the place while trying to work in Vim, I was able to just basically, do a quick Command 0, and I typed the word event. And what came up with this top result that I'm pointing at with my cursor right now. And we see that there's actually two classes called event that are included with in two different vendor libraries. And so we're avoiding a namespace conflict by calling the namespace within a use statement here. So what Guzzle does is it actually extends the Symfony event dispatcher, which is technically called Symfony component event dispatcher event is its real class name. But with a use statement, I can say it's something as simple as use Symfony component event dispatcher /event as Symfony event. And then my class can actually say, I can call my class event if I want to, and there's not going to be any namespace conflicts going on, and I'm able to extend Symfony event. So, in the past where we might have been in a situation where if I tried to include both of these with an include once statement on another file, I would have a collision that would happen where essentially it would say whichever one is on the bottom of the stack is the one that's going to be event, and the other one essentially gets ignored. And so this is really super, super useful. So if we look at how a Drupal 8 module might be set up, one thing that's changed about core in Drupal 8, and I'm going to switch over to PHP Storm really quick. I hope you guys can see this, but this is what the root directory looks like. And when we look at what's in here, we actually have a folder called core. And so there's no more sites all modules. We'll just put our module in modules. So in this case, the module that I have here is Drupal 8 demo, D8 demo. So back to the slides. So this one is Drupal demo controller, MyController, and that just points to modules /demo, which is the demo module. And then there's a lib directory that is looked up by the autoloader, and then that finds the actual project, and then there's the namespace, and then there's the name of where the controller actually lives within the controller directory. So you can see how the namespace ends up being Drupal demo controller. It's not modules, blah, blah, blah. And this is just a simple controller, obviously, and we'll talk about controllers, actually, I think, next. But one thing that I should note on is also with having the ability to use object-oriented programming in Drupal 8 means that we can actually do cool stuff where we can, in this case, I'm just, when we looked at the earlier controller, I had a text function that said hello world, and I'm calling this text as a method. And what's happening here is I've decided to extend the original controller with this final controller, and I can then override the page render function that I have here with my own new text. And I can say, don't actually extend this any further. It's the right thing, fine. So what's a controller? That's kind of a vague question because they are used in various ways across different projects. But in the case of Symfony and Drupal, when we talk about a controller, this block of text is pretty useful. It's from the Symfony docs. And I do recommend reading the Symfony book, maybe not top to bottom, but as you run into problems with Drupal, you'll find that you're not all the information that you need about Drupal 8 and development is going to be on Drupal.org or on Drupal websites. It might be in the websites that are for these other components. So in this case, the Symfony.com is a good place where they have a book about Symfony, and they say a controller is essentially a PHP function that takes information from an HTTP request and then constructs and returns an HTTP response. So that can be anything from an HTML page, it could be an XML document, serialized JSON, an image, redirects, 404s, whatever you can dream up. Essentially, the controller contains the arbitrary the arbitrary logic that your application needs to render the content. So our controller in this case was, the actual page method. So this gets into routing. That kind of leads us along to how routing works in Drupal 8. And I'm not going to get too specific into routing because, if you check out the Drupal.org docs around how routing actually works, it's a much better description than what I could give you in the short time that I have to talk. But essentially what we're looking at here is how that paths get defined in Drupal. So on the default front page, /node is a route. Drupal receives a request, tries to match this to something that it knows about, and if it's found, then the definition is returned, and we get content, the node page. If not, we get a 404. So we see that different requests can come like post, get, server, and this will actually then hit the HTTP kernel, which is provided by Symfony. It'll go through the routing component, and then it'll find the right controller that you had to find, and it'll do whatever you need it to do. So if you're writing an app, then you might return some JSON. If you're writing a web page or CMS, then it's probably going to be HTML. So if we look at how we did routing in Drupal 7, this was really kind of an abomination. Hook menu. So in this case, we were calling a function called hook menu, which is an anonymous function that sat in our .module file. And we did quite a bit of things here. We set up the actual route as hello. We set the page title. We set a callback to another anon function. And then we also set some access arguments. And so this is all really pretty clean, but not very extendable because everything is coupled together. And overriding demo page without a hook, I can't do that. I can't extend this hook menu. I can essentially alter it because I've been provided an alter, which is not a fun way to do development. It's actually pretty frustrating because I've got to learn all these different hooks. And really up until I think last year, that was when PHP Storm introduced hook hints for Drupal 7. So if you're still doing Drupal 7 development and you decide to check out PHP Storm, it'll actually be pretty useful for working on your Drupal 7 projects too, because it'll do that sort of lookup, similar to the way that you can look up things like classes in Drupal 8. It actually will give you some hook hints, which is helpful, but it's still really Drupal-y in the worst way possible. So we look at this in Drupal 8, and now we have a routing file that's YAML. Yay. So we have two routes on this page, and it's essentially the same page that we had before, but then also another page that is for the goodbye message. So we had a hello world and a goodbye world. And we see that this YAML is similar to the info file we looked at earlier, but in this case it's a routing file, so I'm defining the machine name of the route. Path is assigned to path. It's not an array key. Holy, whoa, that's helpful. Someone that opens up this file is going to know that the path is hello. They're not going to just think that the machine name / path is part of an array. The title is set the way that it was before, and the content points to a controller. And in this case, we'll see that the content for these two is really similar. It's just one points to a class called MyController, and the other one is Final Controller. And you can do other things other than providing the content key. So look into this specific node. If you pull down the slides, it talks a lot more about routing and what some of the different things that you can do to set up things like different types of responses. In this case, for the demo module we have, we're just really trying to provide kind of a hello world example. So we'll just give the permission access content as well, because that comes from the node module. And that's where we get back to where we had a dependency in our module to node, because it actually provides that permission. And it was easy enough to just sort of borrow that permission for the case of being able to show you guys some requirements. So why use a routing component? I talked about this a little bit already. Hook menu did too much. It handled incoming requests. It provided menu links. Everything was tied to it. I don't think it picked up your laundry from the dry cleaner, but it probably could have with another hook, right? So not cool. The hook function did so many things. We're tightly coupled now. We're not in a position where we can extend. So do we write our own routing component? Probably not when there's a perfectly good one out there that we can use from Symfony. So we decided to use that one. And now we can create routes on multiple paths, which we talked about. So the next thing that you might be wondering is like, okay, that's great, but what if I don't want to just borrow the access permissions from the node module? That doesn't really seem like I need specific permissions for my module. It's not going to be all about just people that can access content. So in Drupal 7, we had these procedural access callbacks. But this is replaced by services in Drupal 8, so we have AccessCheck services. So setting this up is fairly simple. But first, so that we can, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's look at Drupal 7 and say, what was that access callback? Well, it was essentially another area key that we knew that was very Drupal specific that said, okay, use this access callback, demo anonymous access only. So in this case, what I want to do is provide access only to anonymous users, which is kind of silly, but it's fun. And in this case, so we say, well, let's call a global of the user object. Another sort of really Drupal-y thing, I just so happen to know that there is this global called user that I can call and get a user object because I know Drupal and I've dealt with that, and years ago I Googled it and came up with that. So now I can use this user object to say, okay, let's call this particularly heavy array recursing function that is going to use up some PHP memory, more memory than we really need for this simple function, but it's the way to do it. Look for anonymous user in the user roles array. So we point to the roles. In this case, it's a storage object. So the roles are an array that's stored inside the object. And we say true or false. So essentially, the access callback says, if you go to hello and you're an anonymous user, you can see it. Otherwise, you get 404. Or an access denied. OK, Drupal 8 access check discovery. Way better. Way better. So we have the routing file. And in this case, we're looking at our goodbye world. And we see that we have an additional requirement. So we're going to keep the permission around because it was somewhat useful. But we also want to say access user is anonymous. And so that's the key that we want to look for in our access check. So then we provide a services lookup. And so I'll get a little bit more into services after this. But for now, just note that we're setting up a services YAML file. And we're basically saying, here's the machine name. It's always good, just good practice for Drupal 8 to, whatever you're kind of doing, whatever service you're using, to preface your actual machine name. But I could call this anything, really, on this level. And then on the next level, I'm actually pointing to my AccessCheck class. And so that the services container can pick this up, it's gonna the Drupal services container will look for a services YML file and actually assign things based on what type of tags you provide it. So in this case, this is an access check, and it'll know what to do with that. And honestly, we don't really have time to get into that too much, but that's pretty much what you need to know. I'm setting up an access check. Let's go ahead and assign that with the right tag. So here's our actual class that we built. And in this case, it's got some use statements at the top with its namespace. And we see that this is for use for routing, so we can kind of see what we need to do here. And we're implementing an interface called AccessCheckInterface, which is provided by Drupal core from the session. So the current session is provided through this service, and we're able to actually say, okay, there are a couple of functions that we have to, or methods that we have to implement with the AccessCheckInterface. And in this case, one of them is applies. And this applies to the route, so the current route. And the route gets passed in. And we say, if the route, essentially what we're saying is, by having this function in place, we're basically saying, route has requirement, access user is anonymous. So there's where our machine name comes in. And essentially now that we know that as it's running through these access checks, that the module has assigned to this key, it will know then that it actually needs to run the access function on it and return a static response as either allow or deny. And in this case, what's really cool, though, you'll see that because I have the account interface available, I can pass it in through this access function or method, and I can actually call account is anonymous as a method on the account object. So that is essentially, we're doing a little bit of dependency injection there to subvert having to call a global to get the user object to do some funky things about what roles it has. We're literally just we're doing something that's really self-documenting here and saying, hey, call the is anonymous method. Are they anonymous? No? All right. So another thing that comes up a lot when you're building modules is like, what am I going to do, though, as things get generated? So things like views, they get created by my module. So I might be creating things that are dynamic, and I need to actually not just hard code a bunch of routes. And this happens pretty often. So in Drupal 7, we had a loop inside of hook menu to do this. We would essentially do whatever logic we needed to do inside of this hook function, which is doing more and more. It's the kitchen sink of functions at this point. So in Drupal 8, hey, a callback method. Sounds like a good idea, right? So here's how we do it. In Drupal 7, here's the loop that I talked about. And in this case, I've got a module called AutoCat. And hook menu here actually just calls this a non-function that says, give me a list of types as an array and loop over it and make these routes for me. So as there are more types added to the system, and that works, I guess. It's okay. Here we are doing the same thing in Drupal 8. In our routing file, we provide a route callbacks array, and we can have as many methods as we want assigned at this point. So in this case, we just have one. We want to call the routes method on this class called AutoCat routes. And so that's just its namespace and the method that I want to call. And that's all I need to do. And so then when we look at this actual file, I'm kind of condensing things here because it's not really like, you should have comments in your code and things like that, but I can't really fit them on the screen. So I'm going to use the Symfony component for routing, and I'm just going to go ahead and pretend that we still have this, this function to loop over. But you can see what I'm doing is actually creating route objects for Symfony. So the access callbacks pretty much expects an array of routes, route objects. So this return routes is just going to return a bunch of routes that we created dynamically. And we can see that this is really similar to our YAML file that we had earlier where we were hard coding routes, but instead we're dynamically creating them based on something like the type. And so we can say, /add/type might be the way to add one to the system. So that really is helpful because if you think about things like content types or entity types, you might create your own entity type. You need an add page, and you need to actually create dynamic routes for every new bundle that you create. And this is where the way that you would do that. So the next thing that is really important, oops, pass over it, trigger happy, is configuration management. And this was something that we talked about in the keynote, but if you missed it, Drupal 8 has this, this system with the YAML files where we can actually also store configuration files. So yeah, we might have replaced a lot of divs in Drupal, but we've introduced a lot of folders, which isn't so bad, but it does require a little bit of learning now about like where config goes and what you can do with it. But it's nice because you can actually edit these files by hand, and I could email you a block and you could put it on your website. It's just kind of cool, really, when you think about it, because that's all stored in config. So that makes for deploying code easier, and it makes for rolling things back easier. It makes for storing things in version control, doing code-driven config changes very easy. So an example configuration file from our module called AutoCat. You'll have a config folder in the root of your module, and in that, Drupal will look for a settings YML file for default settings, but also you could have other stuff in here. So if you have, say, a module and its whole job is to create this new type of block, but you actually want to drop an example block into a region when you install, then you could do that. So in this case, we're just providing this array, and it's just some names of these different types of AutoCats. So if you don't know, why am I AutoCat? That's the GitHub mascot. I don't know. I think he's kind of cool. So I used him for my example. I think it could be a her too. Okay, so let's actually use this then. In this case, I'm going to call global services container, which is really kind of used for procedural code, but just for the sake of kind of updating the code that we already were looking at, I'm going to call it here rather than doing any dependency injection. And I'll say Drupal and call the method config. So Drupal being this like kind of class that I can call anytime and sort of fall back on, but not necessarily, again, a best practice. And call and get AutoCat.settings. And at that point, then I can say that this is in my config variable, get octocats, and loop over the type and do the same thing that I did before. So yeah, I mentioned dependency injection already, I think maybe twice. And this becomes kind of like a hot button topic around Drupal 8. There have been entire sessions around it. And I think that's overkill. Dependency injection is a $25 term for a 5-cent concept. And I did not say that. That was said by James Shore in a blog called Dependency Injection Demystified, which I highly recommend reading because it's super helpful in sort of, it does exactly what it does. Dependency injection is it makes it sound like you're going to have to get a shot or something. It makes it sound like something that's not cool, but it's actually something that's very cool and very useful, and people use it outside of Drupal and have been using it for years in object-oriented programming, and it's a pattern. It's sometimes referred to as inversion of control. So when we think about that, okay, let's look at this sort of dependency non-injection. I have this simple class with a constructor on it that says, what I want to do is call cookie subscriber. I want to subscribe and get cookies. This cookie equals new raisin cookie. So I'm actually creating an object called raisin cookie inside of the subscriber. So now I say gimme equals new cookie subscriber, and when I return that gimme cookie, I get a cookie with raisins in it. That sucks. I hate raisin cookies. So what if I want chocolate chip cookies? Okay. Same cookie subscriber, but now let's actually inject into the constructor method the dependency. And so in this case, I'm going to define the cookie outside of it, and this is where the inversion of control happens, because you're leaving it up to the person that's implementing this new object, or creating a new object to actually pass in its dependencies. So this is an extremely simple example, and so let's look at like maybe a more real-life example. So let's pretend that we are trying to build Twitter. Not an easy undertaking, and we're not going to get it done today, but probably the first thing we need are both users and tweets. So I have this class called user, and it has its getName method, and it has a constructor, and I can pass in the username and do whatever. And the important thing to look at here is in my tweet class, I am passing in the tweet and the username. And then I'm creating a new user inside of the constructor, and then creating the tweet, and then I have a couple of methods I can call. So what's going to happen here is as things get more complex and people start extending tweet, start adding new classes that can do things to tweets, like I think you can actually tag people on Twitter now. Maybe you want to have a really basic tweet interface or something, but if we want to create users inside of every time we try and create a tweet, that means that we might have multiple methods all around, and we have to update every single one of these methods on all of our different classes, basically because we've created this paradigm of creating users when we make tweets, or actually making user objects, I guess. And so what we can do instead is use dependency injection. So I already went over what went wrong. This slide I forgot all about it. But basically, yeah, user class is tightly coupled with the tweet class. We can't really unit test this either because we're, again, creating the users, the user objects. So that becomes more difficult because it requires testing two classes instead of one. So it's not really like decoupled code. And we are essentially not using dependency injection, which is the whole point of this. So let's look at the tweet class now. If we use dependency injection, the user has not changed. It's fine. It just takes a simple argument, whatever. But what's important here to note is that I must have a dependency injection container somewhere off screen, because I now, in my constructor, I have a type class object that I need to provide in the constructor as a user. So I'm passing the user object into the tweet. So the user got created somewhere off in La La Land, and I probably pulled it down from a database and essentially created a user object, and I passed it into this class. So now the tweet class can pretty much stand alone, and it can get extended, and we don't have to update a bunch of other classes or whatever down the line when we want to change their constructors, because we're not actually creating user objects inside of them. So the diagnosis to keep this theme going, it should relieve your symptoms of tightly coupled untestable code by inserting dependencies through the class's constructor. Which is one type of dependency injection. So it's the type that I tend to kind of recommend, and it's the practice is commonly referred to as constructor injection. And again, if you've done any object-oriented programming, you've probably done this before, and I find it to be something that is very useful in Drupal, and people are working very hard on trying to set this up as a best practice across the board in Drupal because of the fact that you can call services in many different ways. So services in Drupal 8. We've talked about services, and we're not talking about the services module. So if you remember Drupal 7, services module dealt with RESTful APIs. That was a module that you had to install to actually turn your Drupal 7 or 6 site into a REST server. But in the case of services, when we talk about object-oriented programming in Drupal 8, we're talking about a PHP object that performs some type of global task, very sort of in a sort of a really abstract way of putting it, but these are called all over the application in Drupal 8, and basically we reuse them whenever we can because we need a specific set of functionality. And so when we talk about a services container or a dependency injection container, that is the actual PHP object that manages the instantiation of services. And this container is really just a giant array of objects that we kind of have available to us based on these services.yml files that I mentioned earlier. So some of those are provided by Drupal core, and you can create your own in your own module, kind of like we did when we created access callbacks earlier. So here we are, registering services. This is core services.yml. I think there's about 12 services in here, and you might think of services in some ways like when we're setting these up as like an info hook, but rather than having to call another hook, we have discovery methods that get called to look for services.yml files and provide these services for the modules that we're creating. So awesome blog about this whole topic, converting the breadcrumbs into a proper plugin factory, using certain things like with examples around services on palantir.net. DAFTW-breadcrumbs work, which is a blog by Larry Garfield. So again, more stuff. Another reason to download these slides because it's full of useful links that you can revisit. So yeah, I talked about the global services container earlier when we were showing some code, and so it's important to note that like there is ways that you can sort of bring in services without having to do dependency injection. So in this case, we may have procedural code that we're updating. You might find when you're upgrading your Drupal 7 modules to Drupal 8 that you are using this method because it's useful for your legacy procedural code. And I think that's fine, for certain applications, especially for like little pieces of glue code. But it's not necessarily considered a best practice when you have the availability of dependency injection. So essentially, though, the long and short of it is you can return different objects with it and by just calling Drupal, and you don't have to include or have any extra use statements. It's just already there, ready for you to go. It may not have the full context of whatever current page you're in, but it will be able to return services like the current datetime object. So that's pretty useful. Again, there's Drupal.org documentation about the global services container. But let's consider the following diff statement. So what I have here is just an overview of some code that I've changed based on what we did before. So I'm removing this line, calling the global services container that says give me octocat.settings. And instead what I've done is I've added some use statements and done a little bit of, I'm implementing an interface, which is the container injection interface. So I'm actually going to call our services container through dependency injection. This is how you can properly actually do this sort of thing in the case where we were creating routes. So I have to set up like a protected variable and run my constructor method that is going to be required to actually include whatever interfaces that I want to include. In this case, I need the config factory because that's what I'm going to do to call my settings. And then there is this static function create that's required by the interface that we're implementing, and that is where we actually set up our container. And so in this case, we're going to return any number of different, we're going to call get on this container object maybe any number of times, but in this case just once to get the config factory. So now we have the ability to say, create a public function called getOctocats that is contained within this class, and it's going to say, okay, this config factory, get the Octocat settings, and from it, get the Octocats array. So now, when we actually have our routes function, we don't have to call config and then get from config, we can just say this get AutoCats as type. So what did that do for us? It looks like a little bit more code, and it's a little bit harder to read and understand, but by implementing this interface, we use constructor injection, we added this public method, and we replaced the global services container, and we get unit testing available. We can test this now because we can mock config. So this is a snippet from a PHP unit test. And what I'm doing here, there would actually be a little bit more code up here where I would say like a get info method that would tell the PHP unit how to discover this test. But essentially what happens when I define my actual test method, I'm just going to mock an array. So these aren't actual ones that are in the module, but I know that they are names of AutoCats. And then I can do, with PHP unit, I can call a mock builder. And I can say, use this namespace to create a config object, a mock one, and then expect some things. So I expect in when I'm testing my method that I'm going to say, get AutoCats, and the config factory that's created is also going to expect a get call on its AutoCat.settings. And so that all gets returned with these mocked values. So in this case, we're going to return types from AutoCats, and we're going to actually return the config value. This is a little bit strange because this is kind of backwards from the way we would think about it, but it also makes sense from a code readability standpoint. So now what I can do when I'm running my tests is I can say this variable AutoCat routes is a new AutoCat routes object, inject the config factory, and boom, now I can call get AutoCats and test that actual method in a unit test and say, okay, did it return empty? That's good or bad. And did it return the right number of items? So automated testing in Drupal in general, when we talk about it, in the past and really still in the present, we're doing a lot of automated testing with simple test. And so this is supported still, but it's not really recommended if you can avoid it, because we can do testing with PHP unit. It's included out of the box. And the view behind PHP unit is that the sooner you detect code mistakes, the quicker you can fix them. So you should be able to create a bunch of failing, like little tiny failing tests, PHP unit tests when you first start creating a new module, and you should be able to then do test-driven development with it much easier because you can run these from the command line. You don't have to do what we had to do with Drupal 7 and earlier when we had simple test, which is essentially bootstrap an entire fake Drupal and run tests on it in this sort of pseudo environment that isn't reality. And that was a very, it's a labor-intensive way to run tests. It takes time, and it is essentially kind of useless in the case where you just want to run a simple, it's not really a simple test at all. It's funny that it's called simple test. So, for example, if we want to run a PHP unit test from the command line, I can call vendor bin PHP unit, install on my machine, and then I could run a single test just by assigning this filter. And so there's a ton of info on PHP unit, and it's used widely across the PHP community. I think we're at about like a 1 to 40 or 50 ratio between unit tests and simple tests. So that's something that you can definitely get involved in with Drupal right now, with Drupal 8 development, converting tests over to unit tests when possible. We're just writing new unit tests because honestly, like, we have a lot of stuff that's just not covered. Our test coverage is not particularly good. We have a lot of simple tests, and they don't really necessarily cover everything that we could cover with proper unit tests. So speaking of the command line and running commands on the command line, using Drush in Drupal 8, I'm assuming since almost the entire room had mentioned, had raised their hand when I asked about Drupal 8 and if they've ever used it, I imagine that probably you guys have used Drush. Just a couple things to note. The Drush project has moved all development to GitHub, so it's no longer drupal.org/project/drush. You'll get a link to redirect you to the GitHub project. And Drush requires a composer now to build it, which is pretty cool because they're actually using code from other projects and removing code from Drush that's unnecessary. Very similar to the way that we're doing that in Drupal 8. So you'll have to install Drush, but it can be done with one line if you have Composer installed. And it's worth noting that if you're doing D8, you need Drush 7 or higher. And some commands are deprecated. So Who here has ever called drush cc all on their website? You can't do that anymore. You have to call cache rebuild. Sorry. If you're attached to it. Yeah, so no cc all anymore. It's cache rebuild, and it works a little bit differently. But this is obviously has to do with changes that have happened in Drupal 8. Other commands are just incompatible right now, or maybe forever. So in the past, if you wanted to disable a module, you'd say drush this module name, which was short for pm-disable. And now you're actually going to want to use the uninstall. So this is something that existed before. It was drush pmu module. So you're uninstalling modules now. You're not just disabling them. But in the end, don't worry. I learned all these things myself by trying those other commands and getting warnings from drush. And it tells you exactly what you need to call instead and why. So it's really good at documenting itself right now. So the place to get drush is github.com/drush-ops, which is their team, /drush. And so that's a GitHub project. And it's pretty cool because now you can fork drush and file pull requests and actually track the issues in a much more sane fashion. And considering that it wasn't ever like a Drupal module or anything, I find that GitHub is a much better place for the development to be happening. So that's very cool. So I'm doing pretty good right now, I think. Yeah, I got like 5, 6 minutes. Twig. Did anyone attend the Twig session earlier? Yeah. So I'm not going to go into this too much. Twig, it's pretty awesome. I think the biggest thing about it is I learned how to use Twig by creating a Silex project, and then now that Twig is into Drupal 8, I already know how to use it. So by learning Twig, you essentially get to learn this templating language that works for multiple systems, and it's very fast. And because we're not, we don't have the ability to run these specific PHP functions. There isn't going to be the cases has anyone maybe come across a Drupal website or even built one themselves where they were doing complex PHP on the theme layer? One guy kind of raises his hand but doesn't really because maybe you had to, or things like preprocessed functions or whatever. It's kind of locked down now. We're a little bit more secure, so that's very good because we can't do the things that we could before, but we can do other things. So we still can have some logic in the themes layer, but we've sort of broken that up. And we can define custom tags, filters, create basically our own DSL. So that's awesome. And so we look at what to do. Hey, we still have some hooks around. All right. So setting up a theme template in our module, what I've done here is I have called hook theme, and all I'm doing is setting up what variables get passed into it and which theme template to use, and here's its machine name. So a little bit of that Drupal that we know and have gone to either love or hate is still there with hook theme, but thankfully that's kind of where it ends. So in the case of our controller, we saw this code earlier, but essentially, we have this theme function called octocat page, and then we pass in this type variable to it that came from the page request. So in this case, I should probably be escaping this or something, or check plain on it or whatever, but again, this is pseudocode. And then what happens is we end up getting pointed to this twig file from our hook theme setup, and we see that the type variable is used in various places. So in this case, we know where the images are at in the module, things like that. So a little bit basic for a Twig overview, but you can kind of see where this becomes very useful. And then we get into plugins, which I cannot possibly dig into completely in 3 minutes. But
about 15 to the end of the session.
15? I set my clock for 50 minutes. If we have 15 minutes, then we could probably get it done. But I don't want to keep anybody.
It's 2:30 to 2:45 is when the session's over.
Okay. Well, that would leave no time for questions, but we can definitely go into plugins. I'm happy to do it. So what was going on in earlier versions of Drupal? If you learned how to use the block system, you knew how to use the block system. If you learned how breadcrumbs worked, you learned about breadcrumbs. Over time, you climbed the Drupal learning curve and you learned all the specific Drupalisms, probably 20 different various APIs, and it was very painful. This is not how we are going to work in the future, and it's not how we're working in Drupal 8 because it's not useful time spent. It's time spent learning Drupalisms, and it's not why you're here. You're here to make awesome applications and websites and things like that. You're not here to learn about another simple API that you can't reuse later. So if you wanted to work with blocks, for example, in Drupal 7, you had to call, at a minimum, 2 hooks, probably 4. You would call hook block info and set up all the info about your blocks. Then you call hook block view, and if you had multiple blocks, you had a switch statement inside of it, and you switched on the delta, and you created these standalone blocks. And then if you had settings forms, you had a hook block settings, and what's a good form without a validator, so you had the validation hook as well. So all of those things had to get set up. So essentially an entire lexicon just around using blocks in Drupal. These are plugins in a way, but it's plugin hell. So in Drupal 8, we have the plugin system. So in D8, we have a universal plugin system. Many core components are now discrete objects. Many are still being converted to these plugins. So what started with blocks and views in Drupal 8 has spread essentially like a gospel to almost, a large majority of Drupal core, where things like fields, image effects, and even breadcrumbs are now plugins. And that's pretty awesome because now we can extend them, but also once you learn how the plugin system works in Drupal 8, you can apply it everywhere. You learn the single idea, and you apply it across the board. So if you know how block plugins work, that's probably the most complicated implementation if you actually look at the code that I've seen so far. There are other simpler plugins out there like the image effects or things like the tour module that you can look at in core, and those are examples. And I think that the one thing that is probably worth noting is that while setting up the info around your plugin when you're extending a plugin base can be done in multiple ways, a common pattern that you'll find in places like blocks are these things called annotations. And so this, what appears to be just a comment, actually has within itself a annotation. But essentially what we're doing here is we're just extending block base. So we have, so we have this, modules, demo, lib, Drupal, demo, plugin, block, demo block. This is all that we need with, finishing out what is required by extending block base, which I didn't want to fit on this page. Setting up default configuration, setting up the form, all the different things that you'll need to do to create a block is done on this single class. And so you can basically have this block type now created. And that's pretty great because in the case before, when we talked about Drupal 7, when we created the switch statement for these singular blocks, it was a one-off. So I had a single block I could use, and if I wanted to reuse it or do anything else with it, I essentially had to continue along this pattern. But what we do with plugins instead, like in the case of blocks, is we're actually providing a block type. Because blocks are entities in Drupal 8, that means that our plugin class actually, so in this case demo block, is a reusable block. So discovering plugins automatically could have probably been done with a getInfo method on the block. That would have made some sense, but it's kind of a memory problem. You'd essentially be parsing a lot of PHP for every plugin class during discovery. Probably wouldn't scale well. So what we did, and this goes back to some of the work that Checks has done for core, is we brought in the Doctrine project, and they have an annotation mechanism. And essentially what we did was we have these things, these PHP tokens. So you might have seen this before in other places in OO projects, where there's things like the deprecated token is actually assigned to classes that are still around that you can use, but they're not recommended, things like that. So what we did was we set up a plugin discovery mechanism that works within this. So now we can actually read this, but it's lazy loaded essentially. So the annotations are read, and the plugins get discovered, and then the class is actually pulled in and used when necessary. So that's pretty great. So yeah, questions? I could bring up some code.
Where are the slides again?
So the slides, I'll bring up the URL. So it's myname.github.io/d8slides. And all of this stuff, too, is on GitHub, the stuff that I talked about, so the AutoCAD module, whatever else. I don't know if I have internet right now, but I could pull up a little bit of code. Yeah, so I have a bunch of different demo modules. Another cool thing that you should check out while we have time to talk about setting up modules. Obviously, you know, one thing that we didn't really get into is all of the different boilerplate that comes with setting up a new Drupal module. So one cool project that you can pull down, if you're comfortable using Composer, which you should learn if you're not, is this project. It's github.com/HONDrupal, and it's the Drupal app console. And what this is there's, in many PHP projects, there's actually these scaffolding modules, scaffolding generators. So in this case, we have a module generator for Drupal 8 that runs on the Symfony console. And essentially, it's like a command line interface similar to Drush, but it lets you automate the creation of modules and set up all that boilerplate code. So that whole giant lib directory with like 6 folders deep, it'll do that for you. So all you really have to tell it is that, like, hey, I want to create a module, and I want to do routing. I want some stub controllers put in place. It'll even stub unit tests. So it's pretty cool. And then what you end up with is, like in the case of running the module one, if we go into Storm, I think my demo 5 module was actually generated. Yeah. So it generates everything that's in this folder, all the way down within the lib directory, was all actually created by this scaffolding generator. So it gave me a simple test that I could look at and see how that works. It gave me some routing, gave me a controller for my route with a hello action, and gave me an info file, obviously. Basically everything I needed to start writing a new module without necessarily understanding even the full implications of what all of these things mean. So that can be a really good way to learn and actually just save you a lot of time. So you say, well, I know that I'm going to create a module that shows a page, rather than, you know, copying and pasting and renaming another module that you've already created or whatever. It's pretty useful to actually be able to just do something like what they show here, where these are the different prompts that you get. So it'll say module name, and you'll name your module with its proper machine name. You'll just give its description and package, and it'll start asking you questions, and there are default answers. And it'll run through, and then when, you know, here they're calling the tree command, Unix command, and look at what is going on here. That's what was created just by that simple thing. So I highly recommend checking this out, if not for creating your modules, at least for, you know, helping you understand what's going on. Chris?
Can you show us another example of a plugin? We looked at a plugin that was essentially a block. But
yeah.
It sounds like the simplest of all possible cases.
It is probably the simplest of cases. So what we were actually looking at is, in my, not to, you know, waste anyone's time too much, but in the case of like the block, what we saw here was like it had a configuration, it had the block form. So all the things that were hooks before, the build method being the view, is that. So I don't have an example plugin in my project for us to look at, but we can always look at core. And I think that probably a good one to look at within core might be like, let's see. Maybe tour module. Where did you go? This module. Oh no, I'm looking at core components. Yeah. Actually, let's look at images. So, yeah. Well, that's the interface. Sorry.
Is it in the modules directory?
The modules directory within core just contains, oh yeah, my bad. I get confused. Yeah, so I'm looking at the core folder. I thought that modules directory was that. Yeah, it is in the modules directory. I'm sorry. So let's look at tour. And we can see within it has a lib, and it has a couple of plugins. In this case, the tips. So the tips on the tour module are like a custom plugin. So let's try to fold this in and look at what it does here. So in this case, it's going to extend a plugin base and also implement a container factory plugin interface. So for a custom plugin, And so you can sort of see what happens here where we have a constructor and it has some things that it requires, including like a thing like a token. Oh. And so here is the create interface where we have the container that actually gets called. So it looks like for these specific tips, we need to get a token from the container for each tip, which makes sense because I would imagine a tip would have its own sort of ID system. Let's see. So yeah, I mean, I'm like just shooting from the hip here because I didn't anticipate that question. But essentially, what we're seeing here is like how you can see how in Drupal core, as a point of reference, where there is code that is, if not self-documenting, code that has nice doc blocks to show you what's going on with each plugin. But each of your plugins can be pretty unique. Like, you're always probably going to extend plugin base and maybe implement interfaces, depending on what you're doing. So if you're creating a plugin type, that's a whole other thing, probably a whole session. If you're extending an existing plugin to make a plugin, that's a much easier thing to do, which is what we showed in our example.
That was the reason why I was raising my hand. I was trying to distill from what we're seeing in plugins what is common among all plugins.
Yeah.
And it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that they're always going to have an annotation. They're always going to
Well, that's not necessarily true. The info for a plugin, depending on when you define your plugin type, you can avoid the annotation bit. And I believe there's other methods of discovery, but I don't really know them. It's probably a question more for someone like Tim Plunkett or Larry.
There are other methods of discovery, but I have never seen it used once. You can actually program a hook to actually be the discovery method. There are other pluggable discovery methods you can create on a plugin manager, but I've never seen them used.
And in my opinion, you know, to sort of expound upon your point, I kind of feel like we should probably be following a somewhat standard here. So if you can provide the annotations, and I think that maybe, you know, there were some arguments around like people not liking having code inside of comments, which is where this sort of comes from, like, all right, we'll give you the opportunity to do this another way. But yeah, probably 9 times out of 10, there'll be an annotation.
The other two common things is that your plugin will always be a class.
Yeah.
And that class will always extend some kind of base class, which basically establishes all the requirements of what your plugin needs to do.
Right.
And it seems like the constructor method and stuff like that are just what is in a lot of the different plugins. But for the most part, you could get your IDE to code complete a number of methods for you by extending the base class and just implement code.
Precisely, and that's a really good example of like, so for example, if we're implementing container factory plugin interface, so this interface is going to require specific stuff. So like if I actually say delete this block, oops. You're going to see up here now, I have like almost like a misspelling in PHP Storm, and it's showing me that like class must be declared abstract or implement the create method. So I know that this isn't going to parse without even trying to run it because PHP Storm has helped me out there by trying to parse through the code for me in the background. So we return what we had before, and it goes back to being happy.
Do all plugins implement that same interface?
So the container factor would be like if you need to, in the case of your plugin, actually use the services container. So if you need to use dependency injection, that's what you would use.
I think the answer is that if you wanted to create a tooltip plugin, yes, you would have to.
Yeah. Well, yes, I would say so. Although you might not have to have the use statement because it's provided at the top here. We'd have to try that out. But essentially, you're definitely going to be extending tip plugin base to create a new tip type. Of your own tip plugin. But in the case of that, it's not always when you need to use these things, it's when you need to provide a new one. Like in the case of when we're extending block base, because we want to provide a new block type. So if you're just trying to, say, create a block or another copy of a block that already exists, you don't have to do any of that. You're just using this existing plugin. So yeah, my time is up. I'm getting a warning. They're going to start playing the music for me. Thanks to the Academy. Thanks everyone for coming out.